Deep in the American South, beneath layers of forgotten soil and overgrown landscapes, lies a secret that could have changed everything about how we eat today. For centuries, farmers grew something so powerful, so reliable, that they only needed to plant it once, and then they forgot about it completely. What were these mysterious plants that required almost no maintenance, survived droughts that destroyed everything else, and fed entire communities for generations? Today, agricultural scientists are racing to rediscover what our ancestors knew all along, and what they find is shocking them. The story of these lost plants is not just about food, it's about survival, power, and the choices that shaped America itself. The morning mist clung to the red clay soil of what is now South Carolina, and the hands that worked these lands were calloused from generations of labor. In the 1600s and 1700s, the plantation landscape of America looked radically different from what history books show us today. While popular imagination fills our minds with images of cotton fields and tobacco rows, the crops that would eventually define the brutal economy of slavery, the earliest successful plantations relied on something entirely different. These lands were filled with perennial crops, the kind of plants that farmers only needed to plant once, maybe twice, and then they would return year after year without replanting, without constant tilling, without the same level of intensive labor. These plants were food security incarnate, and they were everywhere. Historians and archaeologists have discovered references to extensive orchards of persimmons, which the English settlers found growing wild and subsequently cultivated with remarkable success. The Jamestown colonists, struggling through their early winters and desperate harvests, discovered that persimmons could be stored, dried, transformed into flour, and used to create sustenance that would keep them alive through the harshest months. The fruit hung heavy on branches in the fall, predictable and abundant. Native peoples had been using these trees for thousands of years before a single European foot touched the soil, and the settlers who bothered to listen learned directly from indigenous knowledge keepers. But persimmons were just the beginning. Scattered throughout the American Southeast, particularly in what became the Carolinas and Virginia, were pawpaw trees, relatively small organisms that produced large, creamy fruits with flavors reminiscent of tropical bananas and mangoes. These trees grew in dense clusters along riverbanks and in forest understories, creating natural abundance that required minimal intervention. A farmer could spend a morning harvesting pawpaws and have secured weeks' worth of calories for their household. The flesh could be eaten fresh, dried for preservation, or processed into custards and preparations that would last through winter. Yet despite this remarkable abundance, something happened. As the plantation economy evolved and became increasingly focused on export crops, tobacco, indigo, rice, and eventually cotton, these perennial food sources began to fade from written agricultural records. They disappeared not because they stopped growing, but because they stopped being valued in an economic system that demanded enslaved labor and focused on the accumulation of wealth through specific cash crops. The transition happened gradually, but it was profound. By the early 1800s, descriptions of extensive persimmon and pawpaw cultivation appear less frequently in farm journals and agricultural writings. The trees remained, growing wild or in scattered domestic settings, but they had been pushed to the margins of American food consciousness. What had once been central to regional food security became footnotes, curiosities mentioned, almost apologetically, by farmers who remembered their grandparents speaking of these foods. The tragedy of this loss would not become truly apparent until much later, when the consequences of abandoning perennial food sources in favor of annual crops meant that every growing season required massive inputs of labor, fertilizer, pesticides, and water. The systems that could have provided resilience, that could have created food security without the constant demand for enslaved workers, were simply forgotten as history took a different path. The 20th century brought technological advances that seemed to make the question of perennial crops entirely irrelevant. Chemical fertilizers could make depleted soil productive again. Pesticides could protect annual crops from pests. Mechanical tractors could prepare fields for planting and harvest. Refrigerated trucks could keep produce fresh across continental distances. In this context, perennial crops seemed primitive, inefficient, and unsuited to modern agriculture. Why depend on what nature would provide seasonally when science and industry could provide abundance year-round? The narrative of progress, which defined so much of American thinking during this era, had no room for ancient practices or forgotten foods. Agricultural education changed completely. Universities developing agriculture programs focused on chemistry, engineering, and economics. They studied how to maximize yield from annual crops, how to create hybrid seeds that would produce more uniform harvests, how to apply chemicals to boost production. The intellectual energy and research funding flowed toward increasingly intensive agriculture, not toward preserving knowledge of less demanding systems. The few scientists who maintained interest in native or unusual plant foods found themselves working at the margins of their field, viewed as antiquarians or hobbyists rather than serious agricultural researchers. Meanwhile, something else was happening quietly in rural and agricultural communities. The people who had maintained relationships with these plants, small farmers, gardeners, indigenous peoples in regions where they had retained some continuity of practice, rural elders, were passing away without passing on their knowledge. A farmer who had maintained a productive pawpaw grove might have children who left for the city, who studied different subjects, who had no interest in learning the old ways. An elderly woman who knew exactly when and how to harvest and preserve persimmons might pass without teaching anyone. The knowledge transfer, which had happened informally and practically for centuries, broke down. By mid-century, these plants had become genuinely exotic in American consciousness. Food companies and modern marketers created a narrative in which American food culture should be sleek, convenient, industrial, and consistent. The idea of foods that were seasonal, that appeared in summer or fall in a specific region, that required knowledge and skill to preserve, seemed quaint and inconvenient. People increasingly bought food from supermarkets, where every item was available year-round, where strawberries came in January from distant places, where nothing carried the uncertainty of depending on what would grow in your particular landscape. The perennial crops faded, not because they stopped being good food, but because they no longer fit the story that Americans were telling themselves about what food should be. They were incompatible with the mythology of endless abundance through industrial production. They required knowledge that was no longer valued. They asked people to be connected to place in ways that seemed increasingly at odds with mobility, convenience, and commercial markets. And so, a remarkable agricultural inheritance, the knowledge of how to use these crops, how to cultivate them, how to preserve them, how they fit into the rhythm of seasons and the health of the land, began to fade entirely from living memory. By the 1970s and 1980s, something unexpected began to happen. A new generation of farmers, gardeners, and food thinkers, influenced by environmental concerns and a growing critique of industrial agriculture, began looking backward. They asked questions that their parents' generation had stopped asking. What if the modern agricultural system, for all its productivity, was not sustainable? What if pouring chemicals onto the land and running monoculture farms actually degraded soil and created vulnerability? What if there were older, alternative ways of growing food that had been abandoned not because they did not work, but because they did not fit the economic and cultural moment of the 20th century? In dusty archives and on quiet farms where a few gardeners had maintained traditional practices, people began discovering references to these forgotten crops. Agricultural historians started reading old documents and finding detailed descriptions of persimmon cultivation. Historians of food began interviewing elderly rural people before it was too late, capturing fragmentary memories of how these plants had been used. Slowly, a revelation emerged from beneath layers of neglect. These perennial crops were not failures of an earlier era, but rather sophistication adapted to specific places and conditions. A pawpaw grove, once established, requires almost no fertilizer, no pesticides if properly managed, and minimal tilling. It builds soil rather than depleting it. Persimmons are similarly resilient. They thrive in poor soils, handle drought with remarkable grace, and produce year after year without the constant investment that corn or wheat demands. These plants represented a form of ecological wisdom, a way of living with a landscape rather than trying to dominate and remold it. Agricultural scientists, as they began to study these plants more seriously, made fascinating discoveries. The genetic diversity in pawpaw and persimmon cultivars was remarkable. Different regions had developed different selections. Trees that performed well in specific environments, fruits with different flavors and uses. Modern genetic approaches had never tapped into this diversity systematically. The trees themselves, when allowed to grow, created ecological benefits. They provided food and habitat for birds and insects. They helped prevent erosion. They required no inputs that had to be purchased from outside sources. A small farmer growing perennial crops could be radically independent, requiring no fertilizer dealers, no seed companies, no pesticide applicators. This was revolutionary in its implications. In the 1990s and 2000s, the movement toward sustainable and local food systems gave greater visibility to these nearly forgotten crops. Farmers' markets began featuring persimmons and pawpaws again. Food writers and chefs discovered these fruits and began using them in contemporary cooking. A few dedicated scientists, working against institutional inertia, began serious research on improving cultivation methods and expanding production. Seed catalogs that had removed perennial crops decades earlier, treating them as commercially non-viable, began cautiously reintroducing them to gardeners with a growing interest in unusual and heritage varieties. The rediscovery was slow and incomplete, but it was real. Most Americans still had never tasted a pawpaw fresh from the tree. Most farmers had never seriously considered growing perennial crops. Supermarket-produced sections still showed no sign of these foods. Yet somewhere in America, an increasing number of people were starting to ask, what else did we forget? What other knowledge did we lose when we abandoned these older systems? How much of what we thought of as progress was actually loss? Today, in the opening decades of the 21st century, the story of these forgotten crops continues to unfold. The climate is changing, and some of the assumptions that drove 20th century agriculture are becoming less reliable. Conventional annual crops sometimes fail in heat waves or unusual droughts. Soil that has been intensively managed for a century is sometimes too degraded to support the chemical dependency it requires. Water sources that farmers took for granted are becoming scarcer. In this context, researchers and farmers are asking new questions about plants that were adapted to regional conditions, that required minimal purchased inputs, that built resilience into agricultural systems. University researchers, funded by grants focused on sustainable agriculture, are now seriously studying pawpaw and persimmon cultivation. They are learning which varieties perform best in different regions, how to propagate them efficiently, how to make them more suitable for mechanical harvesting without losing their qualities. Some are even beginning to explore other perennial foods that were less prominent but present in historical records. Elderberries, various native nuts, other species that farmers once cultivated. Small-scale farmers, particularly those committed to regenerative agriculture or sustainable practices, are increasingly including perennial crops as part of diverse farming systems. They recognize that a farm with multiple food sources is more resilient than one dependent on a single annual crop. A farmer with an established perennial crop can withstand market fluctuations with more flexibility than one invested entirely in commodity production. The economic models are beginning to shift slowly to accommodate products that cannot be industrialized and standardized, but that offer unique qualities that people will pay for. Chefs and food companies interested in local and heritage foods are becoming important markets for these crops. A persimmon harvest from a specific region, used in a contemporary restaurant, becomes a story about place and tradition and ecological responsibility. Native nations are also part of this recovery story. Some tribes in eastern North America have been working to restore pawpaws as part of broader efforts to recover and maintain native foodways and ecological knowledge. These efforts honor the deep historical relationship between indigenous peoples and these plants, and they represent a reclamation of food traditions that were suppressed and marginalized. The knowledge is being recovered not just from scientific research, but from the memories and practices that some communities maintained despite enormous pressure to abandon them. The full story of what these crops could mean for American agriculture is still being written. Some optimists imagine a future where diverse perennial crops are integrated back into the agricultural landscape, where regional food systems are less dependent on oil-powered transportation and chemical inputs, where land is managed for long-term resilience rather than short-term maximum yield. Others are more cautious, noting how entrenched industrial agriculture remains, how difficult it is to shift economic systems and cultural preferences, how much knowledge has simply been lost and would need to be painstakingly recovered. The truth likely lies somewhere between these visions. Perennial crops will not suddenly replace the annual crop systems that dominate American agriculture, but it seems increasingly likely that they will occupy more space in agriculture going forward, particularly as people seek alternatives to unsustainable practices and rediscover foods that connect them to place and tradition. The forgotten plants are being remembered. Their story, nearly lost, is being recovered. And perhaps most importantly, the intellectual and practical understanding of why they matter, not just as food, but as part of sustainable human communities embedded in particular landscapes, is being rebuilt. The next chapters of this story have not yet been written, but they are being written now by farmers and researchers and food thinkers who are asking the old questions in new ways. What can the land provide? How can we live in relationship with what grows? What wisdom was lost when we abandoned these systems? And what can we learn from trying to rebuild it? These questions, which would have seemed absurdly backward a few decades ago, are increasingly recognized as essential for any genuine vision of food security and agricultural sustainability in the coming century.